For this project, we're going to be working with a watercolour material, but we're going to work slightly differently on a canvas. So to start off with, I want you to plan your composition by doing some small sketches. We're using animals as our theme, so I want you just to plan out in terms of tonal qualities your drawing. So I'm going to use ultramarine blue and burnt umber mixed together for my one colour, and from that I'm going to have a darkest tone and a lightest tone, which will be the paper. So what I want you to think through is the colour palette you're going to be using. So the reason I'm suggesting monochrome is just for the simplicity of it, especially if you're new to watercolour painting. So once you've decided on your composition, you're going to draw it out onto your canvas. Now I've chosen this one here to work from, and I've already drawn out my canvas, and on that I've put my masking fluid, which I've used, which is this one here that I've used, but you can use any one. The colourless one I find is probably better, but if you sort of have problems with your eyes or something, you might want to use the blue tinted ones. So once you've let your masking fluid dry, which is placed where you want your canvas to remain light, we're going to start by mixing up our two colours together. So it's ultramarine blue that I'm using and the burnt umber, and from that I get a bluey grey, and I'm going to mix up quite a dark tone because we're going to start with the eye area first. So I'm mixing up the two colours together so they're fairly dark, and I'm using a smaller brush. So the size brush that I'm using is a 1, and I'm going to start with the pupil, the darkest areas that I can see. Now it's almost black on this one, so I'm going to go straight in with my paint, and what you'll find is, because I want it quite concentrated, I'm not using a lot of water, and I'm working directly onto a dry canvas because I want this to look quite intense and dark. The eye is where the viewer will look first, so I'm putting that down, as I said, in quite a concentrated dark way. You might want to use, if you have some, Payne's grey instead of making your own bluey grey. The Payne's grey is very similar to this colour that I've mixed, and because I've used my masking fluid, it's not going to run into those areas, and at the end of the painting I will start to actually take all the masking fluid off. So the eye is always the focal points, and it's a good indicator of your darkest point that you have on your canvas early on, so you know where that dark point is. So we're going to work out from the eye, and I'm going to use a clean wet brush, and I'm going to start to put the pigment into areas where I want it to flow. So because I want to have a little bit of loose flowing, I'm going to wet the canvas first around the eye. Then I'm going to drop my paint in, and I'm going to use quite a lot of water. And I'm observing that where I've put the masking fluid, obviously I will leave it white, but next to it I've got a sort of middle tone, so it's not as dark as the eye, but it is a relatively dark tone. And as I said, I've painted water onto the canvas already, so that the paint will still flow and spread and be quite fluid. Now before you do another coat over the top of this, or do more detail working in with finer brush strokes, you will let this dry, okay? So I'm going to clean my brush again, and use a slightly bigger one this time. And I'm going to wet this area up here too. And you really do, with watercolour, let the pigment flow by itself. So it's doing a lot of the work for you. What you need to be observing is where your tones are sitting. So for instance, I've got a much darker stripe of fur in the centre here. So I'm going to use almost as dark as my eye, a mixture of my ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And I'm going to place that in with a slightly larger brush because it's a larger area. So by having your white areas masked off, you're going to have a nice strong contrast in your painting, which you want to gradually build up. And a good way is to look at these areas as shapes. So here, this is a triangular shape for the top of the nose. And I need to add some more water. Because of the fluidity of the paint and the water, if you have areas where you can see yourself getting a pool of paint that you don't want, use your tissue and just soak it up. I don't actually mind some of these drips coming in like this. I think I quite like the effects of that. You can also, if you want to use a small spray bottle, you can soften some of your edges with that. And again, you're going to get more sort of running of your paint, but it will not touch the canvas where you've put your masking fluid, so you don't need to worry too much about that. So as I said, you're going to be leaving areas to dry. So this area here is quite wet now, and I'm going to let it dry of its own accord, and then I'll come back to it when it's dry and work into it with more detail. Okay, the time that it takes to dry is relatively quick, but you might find, if you are a fast worker, that you want to have two canvases to work on at the same time, so that you can go between each one. So we're working out where the sun is coming, and it's coming from the left hand side here and hitting the face on this side. So this side is much darker. Okay, so we know that we're going to have much lighter tones on the left hand side. So if I go to the ear now, I'm going to just wet the canvas. And I've put quite a lot of masking fluid around the edge of the ear where the light's hitting the ear. And I notice it's a much paler tone than at the front here. So I'm just going to just drop in and use a sort of linear mark to show the hairs, or suggest the hairs on the ears. So I want you to think about your marks that you make with your brush. So as I said about suggesting the hair and the fur, then you can use quite sort of thin linear marks. When you're painting textural sort of animals like this, then this sort of element of the fur takes a while to build up in layers. So this is still the first layer, so there's very little detail as such. Now the top here, there's quite a lot of curls in the hair, and so I have masked off the white areas, but I'm going to put a very dark tone in between where I've masked, and so there'll be a really strong contrast. And I'm going to use my brush in a sort of curved way to make curved marks to emphasize the actual curls on his forehead. Remember to keep holding your brush quite loosely so that you get some nice fluid marks. Now I'm going to go back to a wet canvas area for the top of his head, and because my water is starting to get a little bit of the colour in, I don't really mind that at the moment because I don't want just white. I do want a slight tint of the colour. I'm going to start thinking about now developing the face in terms of tonal qualities. So I also have got the section of the body here, which I'm going to put in a wash for, and I'm going to put in quite light pale colours for the top area, but then gradually in some of the sort of areas I'm going to add a darker tone. Now with the dripping, as I said, I personally don't mind that, but if it does bother you, use a tissue and just blot it up as soon as you see it happening. Okay. I've got my canvas at a slight angle. You might want to work on it just flat. The nice thing about working on canvas is that you've got something that's already ready to go up on the wall. You don't need to frame it. Usually with watercolour paints, you have to put glass in front of them. So this is a good sort of way around that. And also the texture of the canvas gives the painting a nice quality as well. Because of the transparency of the paint, you can see the texture of the canvas underneath, which gives a nice effect. Now for my background, I'm going to use an ink, a silver ink, So I'm going to give a contrast again through using a different medium, and it'll all be one tone, so it won't be different tones as the watercolour is currently coming out in different tones. So that in itself creates a nice contrast between the background and the actual subject matter. So as I said, if you want to sort of spread your paint and create more effects, then by using a water spray bottle, you do get quite a nice lot of movement of the paint. So what I'm going to do is show you a slightly more finished piece so that you can see the final effects. And also I'm going to show you a couple of pieces that are using several colours, so that if you're more confident with watercolour and you'd like to try that, then you can definitely have a go at bringing in a palette of 2 or 3 colours, but don't overcomplicate it by having too many. So this area here for his nostrils, I want them to be very, very dark. So again, I'm not wetting the paper as I with the eye I didn't. I'm just putting it onto dry. So the time that this will take to dry, it may be slightly longer than on paper, but at the same point, it still is drying fairly rapidly. So that means you don't have to wait too long to put your next layer and your next stage on. The best way to look at your work is in sections. So for instance, on this image here, we've got the ear as a section, we've got the top of the head, got the eye area, and the nose area in the front of the nose. So there are clear sections that you can focus on while you're waiting for another area to dry. And the nature of watercolour is, when you are building up tones, it's best to wait until it is fully dry, that's not quite dry, and until you start putting in your darker tones over the top. So I will want to push the actual detail of the fur more and perhaps bring in some stippling to create a texture on the nose. So I'm going to show you some finished ones, and the choice of your background is up to you. So, and also the subject matter is up to you. So this one here was the first one that I produced, and by adding the silver background, it makes the watercolour stand out more. I also outlined with a fine black liner all the way around the edges of the sections in my painting. Okay, now this one I've used 3 colours. So I've got the red, the blue and the orange, and again I've outlined it with a fine liner pen. So if you want to do a little bit more research onto working on canvas with watercolour, this book is excellent, and it goes through a number of different techniques and styles to use. This was the cow step-by-step that I used to show you. And also this, I've taken the idea of using the metallic for the background, which really is effective and makes it stand out. you might want to just start with, for instance, in this one, just like a close-up of a bird with feathers, just to sort of really sort of think about your mark making. The other thing that I'd like you to think about as well, obviously, is size. Some of you, if you're new to this, probably will feel more comfortable working on a smaller scale. But if you are more experienced, then a larger scale will give you the opportunity to add more detail and probably just sort of get a little bit more involved with your painting. So this one I did is of my cat Herbie, so there's plenty of detail in there, but obviously I've left areas of white where I've masked as well. Okay, so there's quite a lot of scope for this as a piece, and I hope you enjoy doing it. And this is another book that I recommend as well if you're very, very keen on working in this technique. So this one as well shows lots of good examples of letting the paint flow and bleed. So do a little bit of research as well and plan your composition before you come to the lesson. Okay, look forward to see you.